In this video, I'm sharing some tips on how to improve your mobile photography skills and how you can get the most out of your Xperia phone using the brand new camera app. And I want to show you how even the smallest adjustments can transform your photos from amateur to professional level. So as usual, grab a snack or something to drink and let's jump into the video.
Hello there. So I'm gonna start off this with a very simple thing, but a very important thing in my opinion, and something I always do when I open up like a default camera app of any sort, and that is to enable grid lines. And on the Xperia, you do that by going into the camera app, obviously, going into the settings icon, pressing menu, and here you can see grid lines and you turn that on. And why, you may ask? So this is a great tool for getting some reference guidelines when taking photos, making it easier to achieve a more balanced composition. So if you've watched any other like beginner photography tutorial here on YouTube, you might have heard about the rule of thirds. So instead of placing your subject like always in the dead center, which is the most common thing when you want to take a photo of something, try to frame it up so you have like key elements on either of these 4 points where these lines intersect. So this can really help you achieve more interesting compositions. And for landscapes, you can try to place your horizon along one of the horizontal lines rather than like in the middle. So this can emphasize either the sky or the foreground. So let's say you're shooting something that moves, maybe a, I don't know, car, person, dragon, I have no idea. Try framing it so the object is moving towards the open part of the photo rather than the closed part, or like make sure to frame it so it's into the frame rather than out of the frame. So this will give you a sense of motion in the photo, make it feel more balanced. And this is something I do all the time when shooting wildlife. So I really like to have the subject like look into the frame rather than out of it. That's just a little tip for a composition, and the grid lines will help you as guidelines when doing this. Look at the beautiful light ball. So the new and improved camera app is much more straightforward and easy to use for someone who aren't used to using manual controls. So you simply just point your camera, you take the photo, and it's done. like we kind of expect phone photography to be like. But if you're watching this video, you probably want to know how to take better photos that stands out from the rest of the mobile photos we see everywhere. But of course, you don't have to use like fully manual controls to take a good photo. So my first tip here is to control your exposure. So mobile phones often tend to seek like the correct exposure, but many times the mathematically correct exposure is not the best exposure for the photo. So if you tap on the screen, you get 2 sliders here. So if you drag this one down, you control the exposure of the photo. So the other slider controls the temperature. And so sometimes you might want a colder photo and sometimes you might want a warmer photo. And in this case, this is a warm, like golden forest. Let's warm it up a little bit, and as you've seen, the exposure is looking good, and snap away. So by just controlling those 2 sliders, we went from this to this. It's basic, but makes a whole lot of difference. And the best thing about it, you're in control. You did that, which is pretty awesome. So now that you mastered the 2 sliders of love, okay, that's bad. Let's take a look at the bokeh mode. So my best tips to master the bokeh mode consists of 3 things. And the first one, and probably the most important one, is to control your background. So choose a background that isn't too bright, like a sky or a like sunlit white wall is not ideal for this. So instead of choosing like a boring flat background like this, try move around a little and you might find a better background that's more suitable for the bokeh mode like this. So backlit trees are often a like very good choice because the bright sky behind like trees creates these kind of spots of light, which in the photo will turn out to beautiful bokeh balls. And yeah, I can't stress this enough. Control your background. And number 2, control your exposure. So now that you know the 2 sliders of love, you do the same thing within the bokeh mode. So I find the bokeh mode to work best when lowering the exposure a little bit. Since I'm a fan of warm photos, I usually warm them up a little bit too. And number 3 is to play around with the amount slider. So you press here, and then you have this slider controlling the amount of the bokeh that you want. And sometimes it's better to dial down the bokeh amount to get a more natural result. And personally, I think this is most important on the 24mm lens, but I think the dialed down version looks more natural and closer to what a real 24mm f1.4 lens would look like from this distance. So have these 3 steps in mind and you will end up with some tasty bokeh shots. So with the new telephoto macro on the Xperia 1 Mark VI, you can get super close to your subject, down to 4 centimeters. So like getting this close can give you really interesting photos. And when you hear like macro photography, you immediately think like get as close as possible. And yeah, sometimes that is fantastic. But I can highly recommend to sometimes back out a little bit. So this will not only give you a little bit wider view of your subject and fit more into frame, but it will also give you more light, because when you're super close to your subject, your hands and the phone will block a lot of the light, and this can make a big difference. This is just a little reminder to back out a little bit. And that is also what's so cool about the telephoto macro mode on the Xperia 1 Mark VI, is that we actually can back out and like set the focus and play around just as a traditional macro lens on a traditional camera. And I can highly recommend to enable peaking when using telephoto, because it's so hard to find focus like without it. And with the peaking, you get these lines where the focus is, and it's much more easy to get sharp results. But you know what? It's time. It is time. It's time for you to get into the pro mode. Don't get scared or frightened because all of the camera settings and stuff. This is not a camera settings tutorial, because that's like a whole separate series of videos. But if you feel like you want to explore the pro mode to enable features like 30 FPS continuous shooting or maybe raw shooting, I'm gonna give you a little tip to get you started. So going to pro mode, then click on ISO right here, set it to auto. So this means the phone will control ISO for you, and ISO is, in very, very quick terms, like the higher, the more sensitive the sensor is to light. So in low light situations, you need to bring up the ISO, but higher ISO values will give you noisy footage with like less detail. So you always kind of seeking the lowest ISO possible when shooting photos. That's not what this video is about again. Just set it to auto. All you have to set yourself is the shutter speed. So a slow shutter speed will give you motion blur, and it's also a good choice in low light situations. And a faster shutter speed is good for capturing like fast moving subjects to get them sharp, but this requires more light. But now we're back here with the phone choosing how like bright or how dark your photo is gonna turn out. So to give the camera a little hint of what exposure we're after, press on this button right here, the little plus and minus sign. So here we can set the exposure, very similar to what we did with the sliders in the regular photo mode. And again, for situations like these, I prefer to lower the exposure a bit. So to keep things very simple, play around with the shutter speed and the white balance until it looks the way you want, and snap away. Now you've taken your first photo in the pro mode. And this is just the tip of the iceberg of like the pro mode and camera settings and all of these stuff. So now that you know a little bit about the camera app, let's talk about the different lenses. Look at the light right now. Summer evenings. Wow. So the Xperia 1 Mark VI has a variety of different focal lengths to choose from. So we have the 16mm ultra wide, 24mm wide, 48mm, and the 85 to 170mm optical zoom lens. And a very powerful skill to have is to know when and how to use these lenses. So I'm gonna try to quickly break it down to you and what my favorite uses are for each of these lenses. And these are not facts. This is just my opinion based on my type of like shooting. Remember that you're allowed to use whatever focal length you want for the subject you have in front of you to create the best photo possible for you. Screw what this dude on YouTube says if you want to use another lens. So the 16mm ultra-wide lens is my go-to lens for when I'm in a tight space, and that could be a cave or a house or like inside a dense forest, and there's a lot of things that I want to capture in the same frame. And there's something called distortion that is very visible on ultra-wide lenses like this, and you can use it to your benefit. So these flowers here, for example, and the barn in the background with the sky, like if we have it in the center, you can see how small the barn is. And if we just tilt the camera a little bit, you can see both the foreground and the background kind of stretches out. So yeah, this is an excellent way to enhance like the wow factor of something. It works great on stuff like mountains or basically everything in nature, but I don't recommend to use this technique on people, believe me. So the 24mm lens is the lens with the largest sensor on the Xperia 1 Mark VI, which also gives us the possibility to shoot 48 megapixel photos. It's also the lens with the widest aperture, which means that it's the most ideal lens to use in low light situations. So this focal length is seen as the standard, and that's probably because it's not too wide or too narrow. So what I really like about the 24mm is, thanks to the wide aperture, you can get a very nice blurry background if you get pretty close to your subject, but it's still wide enough to capture some of the surroundings. So when shooting with the 48 megapixel mode and getting close to your subject, you get this very impressive high resolution photo that could easily be mistaken from like a traditional camera setup. And as I mentioned in my other video, having this amount of megapixels makes it possible to take a shot and recompose it afterwards. Maybe in case you forgot about that rule of thirds I talked about. So the 48mm focal length is my go-to when shooting like portraits of people. Yeah, it kind of gives off this postcard feeling, and I really enjoy using this focal length. So it's the perfect balance between wide angle and telephoto, and a great way of isolating a busy scene. So as here, for example, the 24mm reveals the not so photogenic like foreground and surroundings, but using the 48mm gives us just the part of the scene that we want in the shot. So this might sound obvious to some of you, but I remember when I started out, it's very easy to get stuck in one focal length when starting out. So the telephoto lens goes from 85 to 170mm and gives you a long reach for photographing things that are far away. And the same goes here. It's a great lens for isolating a busy scene when you just want to focus on, I don't know, the sun hitting the tree at one little spot instead of the whole forest. And a nice way to give your telephoto photos a more interesting look is again to use foreground. And this is often called to shoot through something. So instead of just pointing your camera towards like what you want to shoot, try to find something in the foreground. I often use like leaves, ferns, branches, I don't know, stuff. You can get some really cool shots with a blurry foreground and a blurry background, which will give the photo a better depth and way more interesting look than just a point and shoot. So a telephoto lens is so much fun to play around with, and I use telephotos all of the time when shooting. So yeah, use telephoto, play around with it. It's a lot of fun, and you can, yeah, it's a whole new world if you haven't used it. So we've gone through all of the lenses and a little bit about the camera app. Maybe you just want to go out and try out the pro mode, which I encourage you to practice, and leave the regular photo mode behind. But there are some times when the regular photo mode is to be preferred. So my last tip for this video is that when you're standing in a situation where you have very bright highlights and very dark shadows, if you use a regular photo mode, then the computational processing will kick in and you will get a way more balanced photo with details in both the highlights and the shadows. It's also a good idea to use the regular photo mode in darker situations, because the phone does its processing and you can get some really impressive results with just holding your phone in your hands and taking a shot. So if you use pro mode in these situations, you will most likely need a tripod to be able to have a slower shutter speed, or raise the ISO, which will result in noisy photos compared with the low light mode. So thank you so much for coming along. I will see you in the next video, and yeah, much love to you. Bye.